It was a Wednesday when it started, the kind of day that feels like nothing in particular. The sky was overcast, a gray, soupy ceiling hanging over the town of Brimfield, which seemed to be perpetually caught in some forgotten corner of the world. I had just moved in a few days earlier, a simple relocation that promised a quiet life, the kind of suburban peace you only find when you're far away from the city. Brimfield was the type of place you could get lost in, the sort of place people move to when they're looking for something they can't name. For me, it was a fresh start. I rented a small cottage on the outskirts of town, where the streets lost their names and the trees grew thick enough to block the light. The cottage was an old one, built in the 1800s, if the landlord's stories were anything to go by. It creaked under every footstep, the floors groaning as if the house itself was sighing in the stillness. The garden was wild, a tangle of vines and weeds that I had planned to tame. It wasn't much, but it was mine. The first couple of days were uneventful. I unpacked my things, set up a routine, and kept to myself. The neighbors were distant but polite, offering half-hearted waves when they saw me at the mailbox. Everyone kept to their own business, which was exactly what I wanted. Brimfield was sleepy, quiet, perhaps too quiet. It wasn't until the third day, when I decided to go for a walk along the old trail behind the house, that I first noticed the footprints. I had wandered past the overgrown path several times without much thought. It led deep into the woods, with the trees bent inward, their branches twisting and interlacing to form a dark tunnel. It seemed inviting enough, and I was curious to see where it led. The air had a chill to it, but I didn't mind. The stillness was comforting. As I walked, I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the dirt. Large, fresh impressions of bare feet pressed into the ground, as if someone had walked there moments ago. The odd thing was, they didn't lead anywhere. They started in the middle of the trail, just beside the moss-covered stones, and then simply stopped. I crouched down, brushing away some leaves to get a closer look. The footprints were clear, wide, bare feet with distinct toes slightly splayed. They were odd, though, too perfectly shaped, too neat, as if they had been intentionally placed. I couldn't understand it. There was no way someone had walked past here recently. There were no other signs of disturbance. No movement in the bushes, no broken twigs. It was as if the person who had made the footprints had simply appeared out of nowhere and then vanished. I stood there for a moment, staring at the strange anomaly. A shiver crawled down my spine, but I shook it off. My mind was just playing tricks on me. It had to be. Maybe it was an animal, or perhaps I hadn't seen the trail properly. With a shrug, I turned around and started back toward the cottage. But then something caught my eye. Just off the path, behind a thick cluster of trees, there was a shape. It was faint, almost indiscernible, but it was there, a figure standing still as though watching me. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't move, didn't twitch. It was too still, too unnaturally still. And for a moment, I couldn't tell whether it was a person or just a trick of the light, the shadows and the woods playing games with my mind. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. I blinked hard, trying to focus, but there was nothing, just the dense forest, empty and silent. The air seemed to hold its breath, waiting for me to move. My hand tightened around the strap of my backpack, and I hurried back toward the cottage, a sudden, inexplicable fear clutching at my insides. I spent the rest of the day inside, trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched. The footprints, the figure in the woods, it all felt like something out of a bad dream. But I couldn't ignore the gnawing sensation that something wasn't right in Brimfield, that something was following me, lurking just out of sight. That night, as I lay in bed, I kept hearing soft noises outside the window. At first, I thought it was just the wind or the creaking of the house settling. But then I heard it again, the faint sound of footsteps in the gravel, slow and deliberate. I sat up in bed, heart hammering in my chest. My first instinct was to check the locks on the doors, the windows, but something kept me from getting up. I was paralyzed by the sound, as though my body was refusing to let me move. The footsteps continued, tapping lightly against the ground, coming closer to the house. It wasn't until the sound reached the front porch that I dared to breathe again. The footsteps stopped. I waited for what felt like hours, but there was no sound, no movement, nothing. It was as if the footsteps had never existed at all. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, the remnants of my anxiety over the strange events of the day. But even as I tried to convince myself, I knew deep down that something was very wrong. I woke up the next morning with a deep sense of dread. The sun was shining, but it didn't make me feel better. It felt too bright, too artificial, as if the world had somehow shifted overnight, just a little. I went through my usual routine, but every time I glanced out the window, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was out there. It wasn't until I stepped outside to fetch the mail that I saw it again. The footprints. They were there, just as they had been the day before, in the same spot on the trail. But this time, they weren't the only ones. There were more of them, leading from the path, curving into the trees, and then stopping. The footprints were fresh, still damp from the morning dew, but there was no sign of anyone around. I knelt down again, examining them more closely. They were still strangely perfect, too perfect for a person to have made them. And just like before, they didn't lead anywhere. They ended abruptly, as if the person had simply vanished mid-step. I felt a cold sweat break out on my neck as I stood up. Something in the back of my mind clicked. The figure I had seen the day before, the footsteps last night, they were all connected. There was someone following me, but they were invisible, trapped in some kind of loop. Or worse, they were trying to trap me. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know who to talk to, or even if I should. This was my first real experience in Brimfield, and everything I had come to expect about the place, the quiet, the peace had been shattered. My fear was real, palpable. Something was happening here. Something I couldn't understand. I wanted to leave, to run, but I knew I couldn't. Not yet. There were still more questions than answers. In Brimfield, this town that had promised peace was starting to feel like a trap. The footsteps were only the beginning. The next few days in Brimfield felt like an endless stretch of unsettling silence, punctuated by moments of sheer terror. I tried to continue with my life, thinking that if I ignored the strange occurrences, they would eventually go away. But I couldn't stop thinking about the footprints, how they appeared out of nowhere and led nowhere at all. It was as though the earth itself was playing tricks on me, making me question reality. And each time I looked at the trail, the footsteps seemed a little closer, a little clearer. I began to wonder if they were meant for me, if someone or something was trying to lead me somewhere. I told myself to stay rational. It was just the isolation getting to me, I reasoned. The loneliness of the cottage. Maybe I was imagining things. But the unease gnawed at me, impossible to ignore. On the fourth evening, after I come back from work, still reeling from the inexplicable events, I noticed something strange when I opened my door. There was a letter sitting on the doormat. The envelope was simple, white, with no return address. My heart skipped a beat as I bent down to pick it up. I stood frozen for a long moment, staring at it. It felt like it had appeared out of nowhere, almost like it had been placed there specifically for me to find. My hands trembled as I slid my finger beneath the flap and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, scrawled with jagged handwriting that looked rushed, almost frantic. They're waiting. You're already too late. My stomach churned as I read it again. The words seemed to pulsate with an energy of their own, a warning I couldn't fully comprehend. Who could have sent this? And what did it mean? I glanced around the yard, as if the answer might be hidden in the trees. But there was nothing, just the same old, quiet emptiness. I folded the letter and shoved it into my pocket, my mind racing. When I went inside, I couldn't shake the sense that something was off, that the walls of my cottage, which had seemed so comforting before, were closing in on me. I paced around the living room, unable to focus. I kept glancing nervously toward the windows, half expecting to see the same figure I had glimpsed in the woods. I tried to distract myself by making dinner, but every sound seemed amplified. Every shadow seemed to move with a life of its own. As night fell and I curled up in bed, I tried to sleep, but the footsteps outside, faint and hollow, returned. They weren't loud. They weren't in the way that someone walking near your window would be. They were soft, almost delicate, more like the sound of a ghost walking across the porch than a person. I couldn't ignore it any longer. The footsteps weren't in my head. I grabbed a flashlight from my nightstand and slowly crept out of the bedroom, my heart pounding. I walked through the darkened house, my breath quick and shallow, and made my way to the front door. I had to know what was happening, had to understand what was going on before I lost my sanity. I opened the door as quietly as I could and stepped outside, feeling the cold night air hit my face. The light from the porch flickered, casting a weak glow on the yard, but there was nothing. No sign of anyone standing in the shadows. No faint outline of a figure hidden in the dark. The footsteps stopped. I stood frozen for a moment, unsure whether I should venture further or retreat back to the safety of my cottage. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it, a flash of movement. Something behind the trees. Something that shouldn't have been there. I rushed toward the spot, my pulse thrumming in my ears, and shined the flashlight toward the spot I had seen the movement. But there was nothing there. No figure, no sign of anyone having passed through. Just the stillness of the forest. But the footsteps were still there. They were louder now, coming from behind me, from the direction of the cottage. I spun around, shining the flashlight across the porch. For a moment there was nothing. Then I saw it, a faint imprint in the dirt, the shape of a footprint. It was fresh, but there was something wrong about it. It wasn't just any footprint. It was like something had pressed down on the earth with an unnatural force. The toes were perfectly shaped, just like the ones I'd seen in the woods, but the impression was far deeper than any human print could have left. And it was moving. The impression seemed to grow, shifting ever so slightly, as if something was walking toward me, getting closer with every passing second. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the edge of the porch, my heart racing. I felt as if I were suffocating, drowning in fear. My instincts screamed at me to run, to get away, but my legs were frozen in place, my feet rooted to the ground. The feeling of being watched, of being surrounded, became overwhelming. Then, from the darkness beyond the trees, I heard it again. A voice. Soft, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. Come closer. I froze. My body locked in terror as the voice echoed in the quiet night air. It wasn't a human voice. It was colder, more distant, as though it came from the depths of the earth itself. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. But then, without warning, the footsteps were right behind me, too close. I could hear them, the unmistakable sound of bare feet dragging across the dirt, the shuffling growing louder with every second. I turned, nearly tripping in my haste to get away, and sprinted back into the cottage, slamming the door shut behind me. I leaned against it, panting, trying to calm my racing heart. But there was no peace. The footsteps didn't stop. They followed me, pacing around the house, circling like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. The hours dragged on, and I spent the night wide awake, listening to the noises outside. The sounds never stopped. The footsteps, the whispers, the cold voice calling me, telling me to come closer. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. I didn't know what I had stumbled upon, but I was terrified that whatever it wasn't going to let me go. I didn't know how to escape it. The days that followed were a blur. I couldn't tell if time was moving forward or if it had somehow become suspended in a sickening loop. The footsteps never stopped. They grew more distinct with each passing hour, circling my house like a predator, never allowing me a moment of peace. I would hear them in the night, soft and slow, as if something was methodically walking around the edges of the house. I would hear them during the day, faint at first, but growing louder the longer I listened. They were relentless, like they were waiting for something. I had begun to avoid going outside at all. Every time I stepped onto the porch, my heart raced. I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched, like something unseen was just out of sight, waiting for me to make a mistake. The letter, the footprints, and now these unnerving sounds, all of it was building toward something. But what? And who was behind it? I tried to call the local authorities, but the lines were always busy. The sheriff's office had no record of anyone else reporting strange occurrences in the area. And when I asked about the strange happenings in the woods, they seemed genuinely puzzled. They had no answers, no explanations. It only made the situation more disorienting. I began to wonder if anyone else could see or hear the things I had encountered. Was I losing my mind? Was I the only one affected by whatever this was? Or had others felt it too? The terror I had felt in the beginning had slowly morphed into something else, a constant, gnawing sense of impending doom. It wasn't just the footsteps anymore. It was the way the house felt. It felt wrong. The air was thick, heavy, like there was something else in the room with me at all times, something watching, waiting. My sense of reality began to fray, and I couldn't tell what was real anymore. The lines between the physical world and something far darker were blurring, and I didn't know how much longer I could stay grounded in reality. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was going on. I had to face whatever was out there in the woods, whatever had been following me. So, despite my better judgment, I gathered a flashlight, my phone, and my courage, and I stepped outside. The moment my feet hit the ground, the footsteps began. Quiet, almost imperceptible at first, but they were behind me, closer than I had ever heard them before. A sharp chill ran through my body, and I immediately felt the urge to turn back, to lock myself in the house, and forget this foolishness. But something inside me, something deep and primal, urged me forward. The need to know, to understand what was happening, overpowered my fear. I walked toward the trees, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The forest around me felt alive, as though it were holding its breath. I could feel the pressure of the dark pressing in from all sides. Every snap of a twig underfoot, every rustle of leaves, made my heart skip a beat. My mind raced, searching for an explanation, grasping at anything logical. But there was nothing, only the footprints and the feeling that I wasn't alone. I came to the clearing where I had first seen the footprints days ago. The ground was soft here, damp from recent rains. I crouched down, shining the flashlight across the dirt. There they were, footprints, deep and undeniable, leading off into the woods, trailing like a sickening path into the unknown. I stood up, the hairs on my neck prickling. The footsteps behind me grew louder. They weren't just behind me anymore, they were beside me, around me. I could feel them closing in. Suddenly, I heard a voice, a soft, ethereal whisper that seemed to come from every direction. "You're not supposed to be here." The voice sent a jolt of fear through me. It was distant, as though it was coming from deep within the earth, yet felt so close, so personal. It echoed in my head, swirling around me, as if the very ground beneath my feet were alive with some ancient, malevolent force. I spun around, but there was nothing, just trees, shadows, and the heavy silence that followed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the darkness. The footsteps continued, each step more deliberate, more forceful, as if whatever it was wanted me to hear it, wanted me to know it was there. My breath caught in my throat, my pulse quickening as I realized I was standing on the edge of something. Something ancient, something older than the house, older than the town. It was as though the earth itself was alive and aware of my presence, of my trespassing. I had to leave, but the fear that had been growing in me all this time turned to panic. I couldn't move. I couldn't go back. A crackling sound pierced the air, and I froze. I turned toward it. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move, a figure standing just beyond the trees. At first, it was just a shape, a dark silhouette blending into the night. But then I saw it clearly. The figure was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that stretched unnaturally long, hanging at odd angles. It was pale, featureless, like a shadow that had somehow gained form. The footsteps stopped. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I could only stare, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure did not move. It just stood there, watching, and then, slowly, as if acknowledging my presence, it took a step forward. The ground beneath it seemed to ripple, as though the very earth was bending to its will. I stumbled backward, my eyes locked on it, my body refusing to move any faster. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. Every muscle in my body felt frozen, paralyzed by the terror that gripped me. The figure took another step, and then, in a voice that seemed to echo from every corner of the earth, it spoke. "The footprints will lead you to the truth." The words sent a shiver down my spine, and before I could comprehend what was happening, the figure vanished into the trees, leaving behind nothing but the eerie silence that had once again enveloped the forest. The footsteps resumed. I bolted. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I ran through the woods, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't know how long I ran or how far, but eventually I found myself standing at the edge of the clearing once again. The trees surrounded me, thick and impenetrable, and the night was colder than I had ever felt it before. The footsteps had stopped, but the air felt heavier now. The oppressive weight of whatever was in those woods had followed me home. I stumbled back to the cottage, slamming the door behind me. The silence in the house was suffocating. My mind was racing. I had seen something I couldn't explain. But what? And what had the figure meant by the truth? The night passed in an agonizing blur of sleep and waking nightmares. But I knew one thing for certain. I had to find the truth. And whatever it was, I had already become a part of it. The next few days felt like an endless stretch of time, each hour dragging longer than the last. I could no longer pretend that my life was normal. What had happened in the woods, what I had seen, had broken something in me. The figure, the footsteps, the voice in the night. They weren't just figments of my imagination. They were real. And as terrifying as it was, I knew now that I had crossed a line. There was no going back. The more I tried to make sense of it, the less I understood. It felt as if the woods were somehow entangled with the house, with me. It was as if the earth itself had taken notice of my presence and was playing some cruel game, a game where the stakes were my sanity and perhaps even my life. But the hardest part wasn't the footsteps. It wasn't the figure in the woods. It was the silence, the feeling of being watched, of being on the edge of something so dark and dangerous that I couldn't fathom it. Every sound in the house, every creak of the floorboards, every snap of a twig outside sent my heart racing. The house had become a prison, and there was no escape. I decided to take action. I couldn't wait for the terror to come to me. I had to confront it head on. I spent hours researching, combing through every piece of local history I could find, looking for any clue that might explain the events unfolding around me. I dug through old town records, dusty library shelves, and local folklore, but nothing seemed to fit. The people who had lived here before me had all either moved away or died in unremarkable ways. No unexplained deaths, no strange occurrences. Until one evening, I stumbled upon something. In a local archive, buried in a forgotten folder, I found a series of newspaper clippings from decades ago. They were old, yellowed with age, but the words were still legible. The articles were about a series of disappearances that had occurred near the forest. The missing were all last seen near the clearing where I had encountered the strange figure. Some had gone missing under mysterious circumstances, while others had simply wandered into the woods and never returned. But it wasn't the disappearances that made my blood run cold. One of the articles mentioned something that struck me with an icy grip. It referred to an old, long-forgotten ritual. The town's ancestors, it seemed, had once believed that the forest was a living entity, an ancient force that required certain offerings to keep the balance. People who ventured too far into the woods, or those who were deemed unworthy by the forest itself, were said to disappear, drawn into the earth. The ritual described a process of marking a person, a footprint, a mark, a symbol, to signify that they had been chosen. It was then that I realized what had been happening. The footprints I had been following. They were not just any footprints. They were mine. The first time I had seen them, I thought they were simply a strange occurrence. Maybe someone else had wandered through the woods, leaving no trace of their passing but those few marks on the earth. But now I understood. The footsteps weren't just leading me, they were marking me. They were guiding me deeper into the forest, into something far darker than I had ever imagined. And the figure I had seen, it was a guardian of sorts, a being of the forest that watched over its boundaries. It had warned me that I was trespassing, that I had become a part of something ancient, something that was beyond my understanding. I had been chosen, whether I liked it or not. But why me? I pored over the ritual's details, but there was nothing more. No explanation of why the forest had chosen its victims. No reason why some disappeared and others were simply left to wander. The truth was more elusive than I could have ever expected. All I knew was that I had to leave. I had to get away from the house, from the forest, from whatever had marked me as its next victim. I tried to pack, to make a plan, but my hands shook too badly. Every creak of the floorboards sent my heart racing. Every whisper of wind outside felt like a reminder that I was being watched. I couldn't stay here, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. The house was a part of me now, like the forest. It felt as if it was pulling me in, keeping me from the world beyond. I didn't have much time. The air in the house felt thick, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in on me. The footsteps were louder now, even inside the house, echoing in the walls. Every time I stopped to listen, I could hear them, soft at first, but growing louder and more insistent. That night, I made my decision. I would go back into the woods. I had to know the truth, even if it meant walking right into whatever nightmare awaited me. Maybe I could break the cycle. Maybe I could uncover the source of this curse before it consumed me completely. With my flashlight in hand, I stepped into the night, the moon casting a pale, cold light over the earth. The footsteps were there, all around me, echoing off the trees like a chorus of voices, each step drawing me deeper into the woods. The chill in the air pressed against my skin, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't turn back. As I walked, I felt the weight of the earth beneath me, like it was trying to pull me into its depths. My heart pounded in my chest, but I pushed forward. I had to know what lay ahead. I had to know what had been hiding in the shadows all this time. I reached the clearing, the very place where I had seen the figure, and I stopped dead in my tracks. There, in the center of the clearing, were more footprints. But they were different this time. They weren't just marks in the dirt. They were deep, like the ground itself had been torn open. The earth was raw, exposed, as though something had clawed its way to the surface. And in the center of it all, there was something waiting. It was then that I realized the truth. I wasn't meant to walk out of the forest. I was meant to join it. The footsteps I had been following weren't just leading me deeper into the woods. They were leading me to my fate. The clearing was silent, save for the sound of my heartbeat hammering in my chest. The air was thick with an oppressive weight, as though the very trees around me were holding their breath, waiting. I had thought I was prepared for what I would find, but the truth was more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. As I stood there, frozen in place, the ground beneath me shifted. I could feel it like the earth was alive, stirring with purpose, moving in a way that no natural ground ever should. And then, slowly, like the opening of a long-forgotten gate, the earth before me began to crack. A low rumble echoed from deep below, as if some ancient force was awakening. My breath caught in my throat, and I instinctively took a step back, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. And then, from the depths of the crack, a figure began to emerge. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, a distortion in the air. But as it took shape, I could see it clearly. The figure was tall, nearly towering, with skin like bark and eyes that gleamed an unnatural shade of green. Its form seemed to shift as it moved, as though it were both part of the earth and something more. It was the same figure I had seen before, the one that had stood at the edge of the woods and watched me with its unsettling gaze. But now it was different. It was not just a guardian of the forest. It was the forest itself. I didn't have the strength to turn and run. My body felt heavy, like the earth was pulling me down, keeping me in place. The footsteps, my footsteps, now encircled me, almost in a pattern, as if the forest had been waiting for this moment. I was part of the ritual now. I had been chosen, marked, drawn into this place for a reason. But what that reason was, I couldn't begin to understand. The figure's voice, deep and haunting, broke the silence. You walked too far. You followed the path we left for you. Now, you belong to us. Its words were not spoken with malice, but with a strange inevitability, as though it was simply stating the truth, the law of the land. My legs wobbled beneath me, but I refused to kneel. I refused to let this be the end. But it was too late. The earth shifted once more, and the footsteps, my footprints, began to glow. They pulsed with a strange, otherworldly light, as though they were alive, each one pulling me deeper into the soil. It wasn't a pain I felt, but an overwhelming sense of being drawn into something that was beyond my control. The forest, the earth, the very ground beneath me was consuming me, pulling me down into its depths. I could hear the voice again, this time closer, almost like a whisper in my ear. You are the offering. You are the last. My eyes shot wide open in realization. I had been the one they had been waiting for all along. The ritual, the footsteps, the figure, they weren't just guiding me, they were preparing me to become part of the forest. The sacrifices of the past had all been leading up to this moment. I was the final one. With an instinctual scream, I tried to fight it. I pulled at my legs, struggling against the pull of the earth, but it was useless. The ground swallowed my feet whole, sinking deeper, faster. I was being buried alive, and the weight of the soil crushed me as the darkness closed in. But even as the earth claimed me, I heard something. The footsteps. The same footsteps I had been following for days. They were no longer mine. They belonged to someone else, someone who was walking behind me, someone who was being drawn into the same cycle. The last thing I saw before the earth completely enveloped me was the figure. Its eyes locked onto mine, and it seemed to smile, a slow, unsettling grin. Then everything went dark. I don't know how much time passed, but when I woke, I wasn't in the woods anymore. I was somewhere else, somewhere deep, deep underground. The air was damp, thick with the smell of decay. The walls around me were made of ancient, twisted roots stretching out in every direction. The footsteps were still there, echoing faintly, but now they sounded like they were far away. I tried to move, but my body felt heavy, as if it had become part of the earth itself. I was trapped in the forest, not as an observer, but as part of it. My soul had been claimed, and now I was bound to the forest's will. The last thought that ran through my mind before the darkness closed in once more was this: I had been chosen, but I was also a part of something far larger than myself. The forest would never let go. It would continue its endless cycle of marking, guiding, and claiming. And no one who entered its depths would ever leave. No one,